Hello, we're going to be discussing the decline of the Roman Empire in this PowerPoint. Let's cover about 50 years of history. So, from 235 to 284, Rome was engaged in civil wars. And you saw a few things happen. First, the military became mercenaries to whomever paid them the most, remembering that Septimus Severus was the emperor who really started this whole um, idea that the military should be the leaders. And in those 50 years, there were 22 emperors, 20 of whom were assassinated. So that's an average reign of a little bit over 2 years. And when you think of the average 20 out of 22 being assassinated, that's pretty good odds. And during this time, the empire started to shrink. And what happens is that the outer edges, they start to see that Rome doesn't have the benefits that it used to. So they break away, and more of these small little cities and towns broke away from the Roman Empire. And what the neighbors saw was, hey, these folks broke away and nobody freaked out, and the Roman Empire's army didn't come marching in to decimate the rebels. Well, that made other small local towns break away from the Roman Empire. Now, in Rome, it is chaos. The provinces are breaking free of Roman rule, and what we see is a decline in trade and manufacturing, remembering that that is exactly what made Rome such a phenomenal powerhouse. And as well, you see the production of farm supplies decline, and food, clothing from the animals. And again, what you're seeing is a great, vast empire shrinking in every possible way. Now, there were two emperors who come next, and these two guys are pretty good, but they're not good enough. So they had two emperors, Diocletian and Constantine. And Constantine you're going to hear a lot about in the next few slides because he was very, very important to the end of the Roman era. But eventually, after they are gone, there's just no way to stop the shrinkage, so to speak. And as a consequence, Rome does fall in 476. That is one date that you should know for the final exam, the quizzes, everything. That is one of the most important dates in terms of history of all time. So let's look at Diocletian first. Diocletian was a military general, which was the trend at this time, but he was not power hungry. He realized that the empire was too large to run by one man. And his brilliance, his genius, was really in bureaucracy, understanding how to lead a huge amount of people. So he divided up the empire into 4 units, each with its own prefect. And a prefect would be kind of like a governor or subordinate to him. And Diocletian was the guy that everybody reported to. Then in 306, Constantine becomes emperor, and he reigns for the next 31 years. And as we have seen with previous emperors, especially Octavian, having an emperor who is there on the throne for a very, very long time and is very stable, psychologically as well as politically, is a good thing for a country or an empire. So his great accomplishments include strengthening the concept of the bureaucratic system. He developed a hierarchy of officials, one for civil affairs and one for military affairs. He enlarged the army to 400,000 men, and he divided troops into garrison troops, stationed in the frontiers, and mobile troops who provided support to the garrison troops. Interestingly, in Great Britain and England, there are wonderful things called bogs, which are essentially giant mud pits that there's no oxygen. And during the Roman era, they were used as trash dumps because whatever you threw in was eventually sucked into the mud and you didn't have to deal with it. Well, fast forward 2,000 years, and these bog pits have become a favorite of archaeologists. And what they do is they essentially empty the bog of all the mud, and they divide the trash, quote unquote trash, from the Roman era and from the mud, and then they have a multitude of wonderful archaeological items to study. In one case, a farmer sold his bog to an archaeologist, and this archaeologist proceeded to pull something like 40,000 pieces of quote unquote trash out of the bog, including letters from soldiers and their families, shoes, clothing, modern any kind of instruments that were used in those days that were considered trash. And these bog pits have become incredibly valuable to understanding the Roman era as it's beginning to decline. Interestingly, they also find a body every once in a while, because again, without oxygen, the bodies are very well preserved. So if you Google, for example, bog people, you'll find that many of these bog people are actually on display in museums. I saw one at the museum in London, the British Museum, and it looks like the guy was awake yesterday, and he was thousands of years old. So Constantine issued edicts that forced certain jobs to become hereditary. So bakers, if your dad was a baker, you became a baker. If your father was a trader, you became a trader, and so on and so forth. Even up until the 1700s, many of these jobs were hereditary. If your father was a blacksmith, you became a blacksmith. And a lot of our last names come from this idea that our trade is hereditary. So, people with the last name, for example, of Baker, generally, go back 500 or 600 years, and their families were bakers. Now, Constantine also built a new capital in Byzantium, and this is the Eastern Roman Empire. So remember back when Mark Antony and Octavian were splitting up the empire, and Octavian took the western part, and Mark Antony took the eastern part with Cleopatra. And we all remember, things didn't work out so well with Mark Antony and Octavian, and Cleopatra and Mark Antony ended up killing themselves. However, the Roman Empire included both the Eastern and the Western. And when Constantine decided he wanted to build a new capital, he decided to name it after his favorite emperor himself. And he called it Constantinople. And today it's still a city. It is known as Istanbul, and it's in Turkey, which is the it's the northern part of Turkey. But if you are standing, for example, in Italy, that's the first country in the Middle East that you would see. And Turkey has oftentimes been straddling that idea of European and Middle Eastern at the same time. Both Diocletian and Constantine used coercion and control to rule Rome, which is not unusual. Most of the Roman emperors did. And this was temporarily successful, but ultimately, authoritarian policies rarely can last for a long time. And if you look at the Soviet Union, for example, and it started approximately 1945, 1946, and it lasted till the late 1980s, early 90s. That's a very short amount of time, because people will only live under an authoritarian rule for so long before they want to have some freedoms. And it breeds rebellion. And if you're a Star Wars fan, you understand what I'm talking about with Darth Vader, right? Slide. He did convert to Christianity, but he did not convert to Christianity until he was on his deathbed. His mother and his wife had both converted to Christianity much before that. But he hedged his bets. And again, Constantine was a pretty smart guy. He knew that a large portion of his population were still polytheistic, so he didn't want to alienate them. But by giving Christians the right and the ability to be tolerated by society, he was essentially putting his seal of approval. Furthermore, on his deathbed, when he converts to Christianity, then it becomes this opportunity for Romans to see that the emperor was quote unquote, a closet Christian all along. All right, so let's jump to the 5th century, and remember that's the 400s because we count 0 to 99 as the 1st century. The administrative structure in the Western Empire collapsed. And meanwhile, in Constantinople, everything is going well. Germanic tribes north of Italy, primarily the Visigoths, invaded Italy and took over. The Visigoth king Alaric sacked Rome in 410 AD, and the Vandals sacked Rome again in 455 AD. It became an opportunity for these guys to make a lot of money. The Germanic kings put a puppet emperor on the throne in Rome until Odoacer, and supposedly a Goth, not the teenagers who wear a lot of black, but the Goth, the northern tribes, deposed the last puppet emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476. It's also important to remember Romulus Augustulus for the quiz. Just letting you know that these are certain people you definitely need to know. So, let's talk about why Rome falls, because there's entire books written about this very question. We know the barbarians sacked Rome, but keep in mind that barbarians had sacked Rome over the past 600 years. Yet, by 476, Rome could no longer beat them back. And there were a multitude of issues that resulted in this, and ultimately the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. So here's a map that'll tell you exactly how the barbarians came in. So you have, remember Carthage that was destroyed in the Third Punic War? Well, the Vandals came through Carthage into Sicily and the smaller islands and easily into Rome. Then you had the Visigoths, the Chalons, the Huns, the Vandals. You had the Saxons coming into this part and the Angles, where our modern day term Anglo-Saxon comes from. The Jutes, the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and all this meant is that all of these tribes that had been biding their time, waiting for their chance to invade the Roman Empire, came in and took them out. And again, what you're looking at here is this was the Roman Empire. This is all belonging to Rome. And by 476, it was all gone. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire over here, and again, here's Constantinople, this continued well into the age of the Renaissance. So, Vandals took over the Roman territory in Africa, and Rome lost Spain to the Visigoths. Rome lost revenue along with the territory and administrative control, because if the Romans are no longer in charge of the area, you're no longer paying them taxes, Rome's losing tax money. And what do you need tax money for? To support your army. Let's put it in this perspective. 48% of the gross domestic product of the United States, 48% goes to supporting our military and defense. That's almost half. And if we suddenly lost all of our tax revenue, what would happen? We'd have to shrink our military. And actually, right now, if you pay attention to what's going on in Congress, there's a big debate about shrinking the military. One of the benefits to this is the fact that a lot of our wartime strategies are evolving and changing, and you don't need as many boots on the ground as drones in the sky. So there are some changes in technology that allows for fewer men in the military or women in the military, but there's also the sense that if we can't support financially the military, it has to shrink. Now, the settlement of the Visigoths. So the Emperor Valens, who was the Emperor of Constantinople, remembering that when the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire kind of split up a little bit under Constantine, allowed the Visigoths to settle along the northern borders of the Roman Empire. That is bad. That is seriously bad, because if you remember to the rise of the Roman Empire, keeping them keeping the northern borders of the Roman Empire was very, very important to the safety and security of Rome. At the time, the Visigoths were friends of the Romans, but at that time, that soon changed, and it didn't take long. And bad living conditions, poverty, and starvation led the Visigoths to resent the Romans. The Romans no longer had a protective river from behind which to defend themselves. And it was again the Visigoths who eventually sacked the city of Rome itself. Another issue was the decay of the Roman idea. The Roman Empire had become too big to control easily, even with the Roman military. Soldiers or families in distant parts of the empire adopted local customs because they were stationed in the territories too long. When I was a kid, my father was in the Air Force, and we moved every 2.5 to 3 years because they didn't want people to get too accustomed to where they were living. And today, again, you see the American military has changed radically. I know people in the military who served at one station for 5 to 10 years. And again, people become very part of the community, and they become part of the local customs and may no longer see themselves as Roman first, but Britannia first. Along with that came corruption, and corruption was, again, off the hook. And if you go back to when Octavian was a child and Julius Caesar was rising to the forefront, remember, Rome was still in a corrupt environment. Power corrupts, and people in powerful positions tend to be corrupted. Soldiers were loyal to their generals and not to Rome, so the military had essentially become mercenaries. Just to continue the comparison between the United States and ancient Rome, and during our battles in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 10 years, the second largest army that fought in these battles were private security firms. We call them private security firms, a company like Blackwater you may have heard of. And these are essentially mercenaries. These are people who are paid to fight. Some of them are absolutely patriotic, but these guys are making a heck of a lot more money than your average soldier who is a Marine or a Army sergeant in the United States military. The Army grew weak from too long of a peace and stopped wearing its protective armor. And this made them vulnerable to enemy weapons and to the temptation to flee from battle. You know, if you are lazy and not drilling every day and marching and fighting, it becomes far too easy to embrace peace. And I'm not saying that peace is a bad thing, but when you are part of the Roman army, it in fact is something that is a little bit bad. Security may have led to cessation of rigorous drills, and the leaders became incompetent and rewards were unfairly distributed. When there's not a war for 20 or 30 years, no one is tested in battle. And, you know, in the United States, we haven't had that problem during the 20th century or the 21st century so far. But if you look at other countries, when they settled into too long of a peacetime period, and again, it can be a very good thing if we remember with the Roman peace or the Pax Romana, but it also does tend to leave people a little bit lazy and unwilling to fight. And another issue was the rise of Christianity, which I alluded to earlier. When Constantine established religious tolerance in the Roman Empire, he took on this title of pontiff. By giving Christians privileges and overseeing major Christian religious disputes, the old Roman freedom of religion lost out. After Constantine, emperors of Rome controlled the religion since they held the power to appoint bishops. Over time, church leaders became influential and took away the power from the emperor. But again, this was an evolution, and we're going to see during the Middle Ages the rise of the Catholic Church and how the Catholic Church was the most dominant force in Europe during the Middle Ages, specifically from about 500 till about 1200 or so. Now we also have to look at the budget. millions were spent on bread and entertainment, or bread and circuses as we called them. And this was primarily for the non-working poor to keep them happy and occupied. Because remember, people are full and entertained, they will not cause a ruckus. This had become the standard earlier in the empire when wealth poured in from all over the empire with the taxes. Well, at some point, when the tax revenues shrink so much, there's not enough money to keep the entertainment going and to keep the bread going. And you are upsetting all of the people who've become accustomed to these social programs. This, by the way, is Circus Maximus. This is where chariot races took place. And if my memory serves me correctly, this is the length of 6 or 7 football fields. So this was one of the largest stadiums ever built in the history of mankind. Then there were also currency issues. Barbarians were looting the treasury. In those days, they didn't have computers digitizing financial records. They had storerooms of coins, and these coins were easily carried away. Roman citizens began hoarding their currency, so less was in circulation. They also hoarded gold and silver, so coins had to be minted out of base metals with a thin coating of gold or silver, which devalued the money, causing inflation. And again, we see this specifically in the 1930s in Germany when the world was in a worldwide depression and people's monies became literally worthless. And this, again, is one of the reasons we're going to look at down the road of why World War II happened. The Germans were really spanked after World War I. And yes, I said spanked. They were spanked. And they were given no opportunity to recover from the war. And as a consequence, people grew very bitter and very angry at the rest of the world. Then we have our terrible leaders. We had bad leaders. We had Caligula, we had Nero, we had a guy named Commodus, which is very much similar to the word commode as toilet. I wonder if there's a connection. But there were some good emperors, and they always corrected the problems. Now, towards the end, there were no good rulers. So, for example, great generals like Stilicho were killed because the emperor feared losing his throne to him. And if you kill your best generals, your army will never be as good as it could be. So if George W. Bush decided to kill the good generals and only keep the incompetent generals because he didn't fear them, our military would be a mess. Then there were the plagues. And, we know of, for example, the big plague that hit during the Middle Ages. But at other times in our history, we have had significant plagues. One of the big plagues that happened in the 20th century, in 1916, 1917, was the Spanish influenza, where 50 million people around the world died. We don't hear too much about it because at the time, World War I was going on. But this was way worse than the war in terms of the number of people who died so quickly within a matter of months. And this happens again in Rome in the latter part of the Roman Empire. And it killed vast numbers of people along the population. The division of the empire also results in the decline of the Roman Empire. The early Romans who built the empire stood united. By the end, Rome had 2 capitals, Rome and Constantinople, each with its own emperor. But to the earlier Romans, Rome had served as something special. It was special. To be a Roman was special. And when you think about what it is to be an American, what it is to go somewhere and say, I'm an American, it has that signifying feeling of this is a country that is strong and united and under one flag. And yet, when you are in the United States, there's so much bitterness and anger towards one another. If you're a conservative, you hate the liberals, and if you're a liberal, you hate the Tea Party people, and if you're a Christian, you hate this group, and if you're a Muslim, you hate that group. And the reality is that we're all Americans under the skin, and as such, we have to remember that. Later Romans of the West only sought power for themselves. Almost every military commander secretly had his eye on the throne and was ready to overthrow the emperor and take power himself. The army spent a lot of time fighting each other for power in Rome rather than protecting the empire. So now we get to the end of the Roman Empire of the West. The Ostrogoths killed Odoacer in 493 and established control in Italy. And really, from 500 well into the 800s, this is called the Dark Ages. Writing disappeared, trade disappeared, food sources diminished. There's all kinds of problems, which we'll address next week in the Middle Ages. But in the Eastern Roman or the Byzantine Empire, things were going really well, and it lasted until 1453, another date you should remember. And this is when the city of Constantinople was captured by the Ottoman Turks, led by Mehmed II. Now, the Ottomans are still in power in Turkey well into the 1920s and 30s. That's just to kind of give you the continuity of how stable this particular empire was. This is a picture of my favorite Eastern Roman Empire leaders, the Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora, and they ruled for almost 40 years and were considered one of the greatest Eastern Roman Empire leaders. And the reason that Theodora is so prominently featured is because Justinian got sick and he needed support, and Theodora stood up and was a terrific emperor with him, co-emperors, and the people realized it, and as such a lot of the paintings of Justinian also include his wife, which is very rare. The other very interesting thing is there's a book called The Secret History by Procopius, and Procopius was sort of the National Enquirer writer of his day. And you can still buy this book and go on Amazon and get The Secret History. And in it, he details how Justinian met Theodora because she was, in modern day parlance, a stripper. And her particular act was to come on stage covered in wet breadcrumbs. And she would lie on the stage and allow ducks and geese to eat the breadcrumbs off of her, and thereby revealing her nude body to the audience. Well, Justinian was just blown away and had to marry her. And, the rest, as they say, is history. So this finishes the decline of the Roman Empire. 476 should be a day that lives in infamy for your brain, or at least for the quiz. And as such, we'll be moving on to the Middle Ages next. If you have any questions, please feel free, as always, to email me or text message me. Thank you.